Loneliness is often misunderstood, especially when it is experienced by sensitive people. From the outside, it may look like introversion, withdrawal, or a preference for solitude. But from the inside, loneliness feels far more complex. It carries a quiet weight, a sense of being slightly out of sync with the world, of not fully belonging, even when surrounded by others. From a Jungian perspective, loneliness is not simply a lack of people. According to Carl Jung, it is often the result of a growing distance between the outer personality and the inner self, a distance that sensitive people tend to feel earlier and more intensely than others. Sensitive people perceive layers of reality that are often invisible to the collective. They notice emotional nuances, symbolic meanings, unspoken tensions, and subtle shifts in atmosphere. This depth of perception can feel natural and effortless, yet it also creates a problem. Much of what they experience internally cannot easily be shared in everyday conversation. As a result, many sensitive people learn early in life to adapt. They soften their reactions. They translate their inner world into something more acceptable, more manageable for others. Over time, this adaptation solidifies into what Jung called the persona, the social mask we wear to function in the world. The persona is not false, it is necessary. But when a person identifies with it too strongly, something essential is lost. The deeper layers of the psyche retreat into silence. This is where a particular kind of loneliness begins. Sensitive people may have relationships, friendships, professional lives, and social contact, yet still feel profoundly alone. Not because others are absent, but because their inner truth has no place to land. Their real thoughts remain unspoken. Their emotional depth remains hidden. Their intuitive insights stay unshared. This creates an inner split. On the outside, there is participation. On the inside, there is isolation. Jung believed that this inner division is deeply painful for the psyche. The human soul longs for wholeness. When parts of the self are consistently excluded, the psyche responds with symptoms. Loneliness is one of them. For sensitive people, this loneliness is often accompanied by a feeling of being fundamentally different. Not better, not worse, just different in a way that feels difficult to articulate. They may sense that conversations stay on the surface while their inner life moves in deeper currents. They may feel nourished by silence, nature, art, or introspection while social environments drain them. This difference can lead to self-doubt. Sensitive people may begin to question whether something is wrong with them, whether they are too intense, too emotional, too reflective. Over time, they may internalize the belief that their way of experiencing the world is a burden to others. This belief pushes even more of the authentic self into the unconscious, and loneliness deepens. Jung would not see this as a personal weakness. He would see it as a psychological signal, a message from the psyche that their outer life no longer reflects the inner reality. Loneliness, in this sense, is not random. It emerges when the soul has outgrown its current form of expression. This often happens quietly, gradually, almost imperceptibly. Sensitive people may notice that conversations that once felt meaningful now feel empty, that roles they once played comfortably now feel constricting, that social interactions require more effort than before. This is not because they are becoming antisocial, but because their inner life is becoming more complex. The psyche is asking for alignment. But alignment comes at a cost. As sensitive people begin to feel the pull toward authenticity, they may also feel increasingly alone. The old ways of relating no longer fit, but the new ones have not yet appeared. Jung described this as a liminal space, a psychological in-between. In this space, loneliness intensifies. There is a longing for connection, paired with an inability to tolerate superficiality. A desire to be seen, paired with a fear of being misunderstood. Sensitive people may oscillate between withdrawal and longing, unsure of where they truly belong. This tension is exhausting. Jung believed that this stage is an unavoidable part of individuation, the process by which a person becomes a whole, integrated individual. Individuation requires separation, not isolation, but differentiation, a stepping away from collective norms in order to discover one's own inner law. Sensitive people are often called into this process earlier in life, precisely because they feel more. Their loneliness is not a sign that they are failing at life. It is often a sign that they are entering a deeper psychological phase. But this does not make it easy. Loneliness can feel heavy. It can bring sadness, grief, and a sense of loss for connections that once felt safe. Sensitive people may mourn not only relationships, but versions of themselves that no longer fit. They may wonder whether choosing depth means choosing solitude. Jung would say that this question cannot be answered quickly. Loneliness, when approached consciously, becomes a space of listening, a pause in which the psyche reorganizes itself. If sensitive people can resist the urge to immediately fill this space, something important begins to happen. The inner world starts to speak more clearly. Thoughts deepen. Emotions become more nuanced. Dreams become richer. Creative impulses arise. The psyche begins to compensate for the outer lack of resonance by strengthening the inner connection. This is not a withdrawal from life. It is a preparation for a more authentic one. Sensitive people often underestimate the importance of this phase. They judge themselves for feeling lonely instead of recognizing it as a threshold, a psychological doorway between an old identity and a new one that has not yet fully formed. And it is precisely here, in this quiet and often painful space, that the foundations for deeper connection are being laid. For many sensitive people, loneliness does not begin in adulthood. It has roots in early life, often long before it is consciously recognized. Sensitive children experience the world with an open nervous system. They feel emotional atmospheres intensely. They register subtle shifts in tone, mood, and energy. When their environment is unable to mirror or hold this depth, the child begins to adapt. This adaptation is rarely dramatic. It happens quietly. A sensitive child learns to observe before expressing, to sense what is welcome and what is not, to adjust their emotional expression in order to maintain connection. Over time, this becomes automatic. From a Jungian perspective, this is where the shadow begins to form. The shadow is not only made of socially unacceptable impulses, it is also formed by qualities that were never welcomed or reflected. Sensitivity itself often becomes part of the shadow. Emotional intensity, intuition, depth of feeling. All of these may be pushed out of conscious awareness if they threaten belonging. The child does not stop feeling. They stop showing. This creates a subtle but profound loneliness, a loneliness that exists even in the presence of caregivers, friends, or partners. The child is connected, but not met, seen, but not fully recognized. Sensitive people carry this pattern into adulthood. They may become highly attuned to others' needs, emotions, and expectations. They often develop strong empathy and relational skills. On the surface, they appear connected and caring. Yet inside, there is a familiar sense of being alone with their deepest experiences. This is why sensitive people can feel deeply lonely in relationships. They may love and be loved, yet still feel a quiet distance. Not because intimacy is absent, but because vulnerability remains partial. The most sensitive parts of the self stay guarded, often unconsciously. Jung believed that when important aspects of the personality are split off into the shadow, they continue to influence life from the unconscious. They shape emotional reactions, relational patterns, and inner states. Loneliness, in this context, is not a reaction to others. It is a reaction to the inner split. Sensitive people often sense that they are holding something back, even when they do not know exactly what it is. They may feel that if they were fully seen, something would be lost. Approval, stability, love. This creates an internal dilemma. To belong, they must remain partially hidden. To be whole, they must risk being seen. This tension is at the heart of their loneliness. Jung would say that the psyche cannot remain divided indefinitely. What is excluded seeks integration. The shadow wants to be acknowledged, not acted out, but recognized as part of the whole. For sensitive people, this often means learning to reclaim their emotional depth consciously, not by overwhelming others, but by honoring their inner truth internally first. Loneliness intensifies when this reclamation begins. As sensitive people start to listen more closely to themselves, they may notice a growing discomfort with old relational patterns. Conversations feel misaligned. Dynamics feel unbalanced. They may sense that they are being perceived through a familiar lens that no longer fits. This can lead to withdrawal, confusion, or grief. Jung described this phase as psychologically necessary. When unconscious material begins to surface, there is often a temporary loss of orientation. Old reference points dissolve. New ones have not yet formed. For sensitive people, this can feel destabilizing. They may oscillate between longing for closeness and needing distance. They may crave understanding while feeling unable to explain themselves. Loneliness deepens not because they are incapable of connection, but because they are outgrowing unconscious patterns. In relationships, this often shows up as a sense of emotional asymmetry. Sensitive people may give more than they receive, not because others are unwilling, but because they have learned to prioritize attunement over self-expression. Over time, this creates resentment or exhaustion. Jung would interpret this as a call to rebalance the inner and outer worlds, to shift from adaptation toward individuation. This does not mean withdrawing from relationships, but transforming how one participates in them. Loneliness plays a crucial role in this transformation. It creates space for reflection. Space to recognize which relational patterns are rooted in fear rather than truth. Which connections are maintained out of habit rather than resonance. For sensitive people, learning to tolerate this space is deeply challenging. The nervous system often associates separation with danger, with loss, with abandonment. But Jung believed that psychological growth requires the capacity to be alone without falling apart. This is not emotional detachment. It is inner containment. When sensitive people begin to develop this capacity, loneliness slowly changes its quality. It becomes less threatening, less overwhelming, more informative. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" the psyche begins to ask, "What wants to be integrated?" Often, the answer lies in the shadow, in the parts of the self that were never given language, never given permission, never given space. As these parts are gently brought into awareness, something shifts. The inner split begins to heal, and with it, the deepest layer of loneliness starts to loosen. Connection no longer feels like something that must be earned through self-suppression. It begins to feel possible without self-abandonment. But this integration is slow. Jung emphasized patience. The psyche unfolds in its own rhythm. Sensitive people cannot rush this process without creating new splits. Loneliness, therefore, must be met with compassion rather than urgency, with curiosity rather than judgment. It is not an enemy to be defeated. It is a signal that the psyche is reorganizing itself at a deeper level. And while this process may temporarily increase feelings of isolation, it also lays the groundwork for relationships that are more balanced, more authentic, and more nourishing. As the process of individuation continues, sensitive people often reach a phase in which loneliness no longer feels acute, but instead becomes persistent and quiet. It is no longer dramatic or overwhelming, yet it is undeniably present. This phase can be confusing because the pain has softened, but the sense of separateness remains. From a Jungian perspective, this is not regression. It is refinement. Carl Jung understood that psychological development does not move in a straight line. After the most intense confrontations with the shadow and the breaking down of old identities, the psyche enters a slower, more subtle phase of integration. Sensitive people often find themselves here without realizing that something important has already shifted. They are no longer desperately seeking connection to escape loneliness, but they are also no longer willing to settle for connections that bypass depth. What remains is a quiet in-between state, a kind of inner solitude that feels unfamiliar but also strangely honest. This is where many sensitive people begin to misinterpret themselves again. They may wonder why loneliness is still present, even though they have done inner work, become more self-aware, and learn to honor their sensitivity. They may expect that growth should lead to constant fulfillment or belonging. When it does not, self-doubt can creep back in. But Jung would say that this expectation itself belongs to the ego. The deeper psyche does not aim to eliminate loneliness. It aims to transform one's relationship to it. At this stage, loneliness is no longer asking to be solved. It is asking to be inhabited. Sensitive people begin to sense that being alone does not automatically mean being disconnected. In fact, many discover that their most grounded moments occur in solitude. Their thoughts feel clearer. Their emotions feel more proportionate. Their inner life feels coherent rather than fragmented. What once felt like emptiness now feels like inner presence. This is a crucial distinction. Earlier, loneliness was marked by longing, self-doubt, and fear of exclusion. This later loneliness is quieter, more neutral. It is less about what is missing and more about what is no longer tolerated. Sensitive people often realize that they are no longer willing to fragment themselves for the sake of belonging. They no longer want to translate their inner world into something more digestible. They would rather remain silent than distort what feels true. This choice has consequences. It can reduce the number of relationships. It can create longer periods of solitude. It can make life feel slower, more inward, less socially dense. But it also creates psychological integrity. Jung believed that integrity of the psyche is essential for genuine connection. Without it, relationships are built on adaptation, projection, or unconscious need. With it, relationships arise from mutual recognition. At this stage, sensitive people begin to experience connection differently. They no longer look for people to complete them or to relieve their loneliness. They look for resonance, for shared orientation, for emotional honesty without pressure. These connections are often rare. They may appear later in life. They may develop slowly. They may not fit conventional narratives of intimacy or belonging. But when they occur, they feel stabilizing rather than consuming. Loneliness, in this sense, becomes a filter rather than a punishment. It filters out what is misaligned. It protects what is essential. It preserves inner coherence. Sensitive people may still feel moments of ache, especially when witnessing effortless social belonging in others, especially when longing for companionship arises naturally, as it does for all human beings. Jung never denied this longing. He understood it deeply. But he also understood that not every longing is meant to be immediately fulfilled. Some longings are meant to deepen the soul. For sensitive people, loneliness often deepens perception. It sharpens awareness of what truly matters. It draws attention to values rather than appearances. It teaches patience with the timing of life. This patience is not passive. It is active waiting. Waiting without collapsing into despair. Waiting without betraying oneself. Waiting while remaining inwardly engaged. Jung saw this capacity as a sign of psychological maturity. The sensitive person who can remain present in loneliness without self-rejection has crossed an important threshold. They are no longer ruled by the fear of abandonment. They are guided by inner alignment. At this point, something subtle but profound happens. Loneliness stops defining identity. You are no longer someone who is lonely. You are someone who experiences loneliness at times. The difference may seem small, but psychologically it is immense. Identity shifts from lack to presence. Sensitive people begin to experience themselves as internally accompanied. Their thoughts feel anchored. Their emotions feel held. Their inner dialogue becomes less harsh, less urgent. They may still desire connection, but they no longer feel erased by its absence. This inner companionship changes everything. It allows relationships to be entered freely rather than desperately. It allows solitude to be restorative rather than threatening. It allows life to unfold without constant self-questioning. Jung believed that when a person reaches this stage, they are finally capable of true encounter, not fusion, not dependency. Encounter, meeting another person without losing oneself, being seen without needing to perform, sharing depth without demanding sameness. Sensitive people often underestimate how rare this capacity is. Their loneliness was not a defect. It was a training ground. It trained them to listen inwardly, to differentiate truth from adaptation, to recognize resonance rather than approval. Seen from this angle, loneliness was not something that delayed life. It was something that prepared them for a different quality of life. If you are a sensitive person and loneliness is still part of your experience, this does not mean that you are stuck. It may mean that you are no longer willing to live superficially. Jung would invite you to ask not how to get rid of loneliness, but how to live truthfully with it. What it is asking you to protect. What it is asking you to honor. What it is asking you to become. Because when loneliness has done its work, it no longer isolates. It clarifies, and from that clarity, connection eventually emerges, not as rescue, not as distraction, but as recognition. Recognition between individuals who have learned to stand alone without hardening, and to open without disappearing. If this perspective resonates with you, and you feel drawn to explore Jungian psychology, depth, and inner transformation further, you are welcome to continue this journey here. You can subscribe to this channel to explore these themes together with respect for sensitivity, slowness, and psychological truth.